Perfect. All right, senior students, this is your last lecture of the year. Yay! And I'm going to go quite fast. This is the fastest I've ever done the whole timeline unit. But my point is, I want to give you a really good overview of what happened throughout history. How did literature change? And I think even though it's just a brief overview, and all you need to do is write down what I write on the board, I think you'll find it interesting to see how quickly and how oddly people were thinking and how historical events changed what people wrote about. So without further ado, here is the history of literary movements throughout the world. Go! So it turns out that in jolly old England, nobody was there speaking English until after the AD period. You did have some people there. They were the Celts. They spoke ancient Irish, Scottish, farming, had a religion with druids and things like that, but they didn't speak English, okay, so we don't really care about them. Okay, we do, but forget them. It wasn't until about AD 300 to 500 that a bunch of Germanic tribes arrived in England. We call them the Anglo-Saxons, and they brought with them their old Germanic language. It sounds really weird. It sounded something like Gefunden ar Gefuthes Streffenthom, okay? Very unrecognizable, but still the basis of modern English. And those people did nothing but write epics, of course. We've talked about this. Every culture, the first thing they do is write an epic about a hero, okay? For the Anglo-Saxons speaking Proto-English, their epic was good old Beowulf, big warrior fighting off monsters, dragons, very brave, very generous, very, very strong, supernaturally strong, which makes kind of a fun story. The only other thing they wrote was histories and diaries. There's a really famous work called The History of the Anglo-Saxon People. They were just recording what happened. And that was it. Epics and histories. Then all of a sudden, if you remember from second term, we talked about a guy named William the Conqueror. So down here in your little box that says, why the shift? Put him in. Good old William the Conqueror. Remember that he came from France, took over the throne of England, and forced people to speak French. And the two languages, Old Anglo-Saxon, merged with the French to form what they call Middle English, which is a lot more recognizable, but still kind of odd. And because he was so feudal, meaning lords, castles, knights, we went into a period that we call the medieval period, which I'm sure you have a sense of. It was all about knights. It was all about relations between the government and the church. And as those people wrote stuff down, they only wrote about two things, 1 and 2, okay? The first thing they wrote about was religion. Life was so hard back then, plagues, wars, dying early, that religion played a huge role in their lives, looking, hey, this is bad, let's hope for an afterlife. Interestingly enough, in writing about religion, they wrote a lot of plays, Bible story plays. And then also, this is going to be a really funny word, but they wrote a lot of these things. They're called hagiographies. I know, that's a weird word. And they recorded the lives of the Catholic saints. So in your house, you may only own one book or two, the Bible and then a hagiography teaching about the life of Joan of Arc, the life of St. Teresa, the life of St. Francis, to teach you how to be a good Catholic, and get to a heaven world. Then the only other thing they wrote was about chivalry. Okay, a word meaning anything to do with knights and the code of knighthood, how to be a good knight, how to serve your lord. Interestingly enough, as they wrote about chivalry, they developed a culture that was very odd. So right here on your line that says including this notion of courtly love. Okay, this was crazy. For courtly love, it's all about how a knight was supposed to fall in love with a married woman. What? Worship her from afar. Oh, my sweet, my darling. She would refuse. No way, I'm married. And then eventually he'd be like, but I'm going to die for love of you. Ah. And she would give in almost out of compassion and pity, and they would carry on this clandestine love affair, okay? Not that people did that, as part of the culture, but that's what they wrote about. That was like the famous story of the time, was these courtly love stories. Okay, it was like the Harry Potter of its time. It's hugely widely popular. The Catholic Church obviously had a problem with that because adultery. In fact, just random fact for you, in fact, the church was so upset about this culture of courtly love that was pulling people away from religion that they actually had a big meeting where they decided they needed something to replace courtly love. And instead of having people have this idea you need to love a married woman, they tried to pick a woman in their religion that the knights could use as a focus. And so they started to heighten the role of the Virgin Mary and make her a lot more powerful so that the knights had some woman that they could do their knightly deeds for. So literally in a meeting, they decided we're going to recreate our religion and have it focus on the Virgin Mary to counteract the culture of courtly love. Kind of cool? Kind of cool. They literally called it the cult of the Virgin Mary, and it changed Catholicism completely. All right. The medieval time came to an end mostly because of prosperity. People started to actually get wealthy. We started to have a rising middle class, and people have a lot more fun when they're not, starving and dying. So in the Elizabethan era, the Elizabethans are mostly remembered for one guy, and that's Shakespeare, okay? So on your timeline, it says 1564 to 1616. Put in Mr. Shakespeare. And from what you know about Shakespeare, you probably have a pretty good idea that just like him, they started to write, number one, plays. They had plays back here, but these plays were a lot more humanistic about normal people instead of saints. And then they did poems. And that's all they wrote. There wasn't any such thing as novels, no essays yet. It was plays and poems with more humanism. That's a word that means we're taking a look at people as they really are, flawed. It's not all about really amazingly good people we need to worship. It was normal people. And also they added comedy. Hey, when you're prosperous, you can have a lot more fun with life. Okay, so that went on for a while. There's Shakespeare entertaining people with his silly plays and laughing at the weaknesses of Hamlet and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, people discovered their brains. This is kind of unfortunate because we went into a really weird time period that I don't really love. Science. We'll put science. It's right about early 1600s when people really discovered, you have Galileo, Da Vinci, and people realized that they could use their brains to figure out a whole lot of stuff. And it plunged people into what we call the Enlightenment era. Makes sense. Your brains are now enlightened. We're so cool. And you're going to love this. There was this French guy who came along right about 1680, I think. And this French guy's name was Michel de Montaigne, invented something, brand new literary form, and he called it the essay. Yeah. You don't like writing essays? Go back in time. This is the guy to blame. Okay? In fact, it's kind of weird. The word essay means to try, to make an attempt. And so he wrote this whole book that just has his attempt to figure out topics like friendship, sleep. What is sleep? And from him, we get an essay. So the next time you don't do well on an essay, maybe you should tell your teacher, hey, this is supposed to be an attempt, just a trial, to try and figure something out. Don't grade me too harshly. But yeah, that's the dude. And understandably, because they were so focused on their brains and science, trying to figure things out intellectually, the time period became one of huge, the word I'm going to use is just intellectual. Actually, I lied. I'm going to add one more to this. It's not that important. Okay, anyway, the point is, they could only write about things that were very highbrow, lofty. Nobody cared about your feelings. your dream life. It was all about science and philosophy, very important topics. They also considered themselves to be very, very funny. They kind of were. But the word they used was wit. It was all about using your intellect, and they would gather in these evening meetings and sit around trying to impress each other with their great wit, you know. Oh, yes, I'm so funny, ha, 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 ha. This is the era of the Founding Fathers, you know, the Enlightenment sort of documents. It's the most dense language that we have. It's the hardest to read, really, because they were very, very wordy. The vocabulary level, the lexile level is super high, crazy high. I don't like reading this stuff, you know, multi-semicolons, just with this dense intellectual prose. But there is some humor in it too, you know, in an intellectual way. 1750, we have the dictionary, yippee! Which again kind of tells you that they were into scientific research, categorizing things, and bam, let's document the English language. One thing that came out of that is that when they wrote the dictionary, this is what standardized our spelling. You know, it was a guy named Samuel Johnson, very boring name, boring job, wrote the dictionary, and whatever he put as the spelling got stuck. You know, so words in English like this, back in 1750, you would pronounce that. You would pronounce that licht. The pronunciation kept changing, but our spelling got stuck, okay? So the reason why we have to have spelling tests in English and why the spelling is so weird is because it got set in stone right there in 1750. Yikes. Okay, it's surprising how long that Enlightenment lasted. 150 years. And they were doing nothing but that. Finally, people got sick of it and wondered why the heck we're not talking about personal dreams and goals and imagination. And then something happened. Actually, the big shift that started it was back in 1789, if you recognize that date. It was actually the French Revolution. The French Revolution was bloody and horrific. It was not, you know, a civilized war at all. It was so violent, so crazy. It got people's imaginations going. And by golly, they suddenly were very interested in why people could get to that amount of horror. And it completely shifted literature, completely, okay? Now, don't be confused. This next topic is called, they went into this period called Romanticism, but it's not about romantic love, okay? A little, you know, we can now talk about our feelings, our imagination. Let's do imagination. You know, emotion. They got obsessed with nature. Let's go out to the woods and dream of daffodils and be enlightened by a communing with nature. It was all the rage. And there's a really important, They got obsessed with the supernatural. Okay, so this is kind of a fun time period to read. It was very melodramatic, and they started talking about things like, you're publishing books like Dracula. The very first romantic novel that came out was Frankenstein. You're getting the idea. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where it's over the top ridiculous. You have swooning women and castles, this gothic horror. It was all the rage, I tell you. Okay, I'm actually going to have my photographer stop right now, end timeline number 1, and prepare for timeline number 2. Ready, end!